is that, and why this correlation to jazz, which I'm going to get into really quickly, forgive me. I'm trained as a theologian, so I can get a little long-winded. Okay, I'll be the first to admit that, but I'm keeping it, going to keep it tight. So I was accepted to Oberlin College in the conservatory. I played the trombone, jazz trombone, and my mom said, I'm not paying $25,000 a year for you to blow a bleeping horn. Okay? I won't say what bleeping was, but use your imagination of what bleeping was. And so I never played. And I wanted to say so bad, you're not paying $25,000 anyway, because if you're from Oberlin and you went to the college, you had to pay $1,000. So I should have just, but you don't disobey what your mom says. Not in 1988 you did. But this is the point of why I wanted to introduce diversity, equity, and inclusion through the lens of jazz. Stan Kenton, who's a famous jazz musician, stated, jazz is a distinct music that depends and thrives on individuality. And yet the individual is not oblivious to others, nor is he or she immune to their feelings. A session in jazz is comparable to an open forum where theories and opinions are discussed openly and freely. That's inclusion. That's inclusion right there. Jazz inclusion. In a jazz band, the trumpet, the trombone, the snare, the bass are all independent. But the trombone does not tell the bass it needs to be the trombone. The trombone says to the bass, be the bass. Do what you do. And eventually everyone's gonna come around and get their opportunity to shine, to be the soloist, to lead. But then they all come together and make that beautiful music that we heard at the very beginning. In layman's terms, we can say in Dr. King, in a real sense, all life is interrelated, very similar to those instruments in a jazz band. All men are caught in this inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. That's the jazz. That is the trombone. That's the trumpet. That's the bass. The bass cannot be the bass unless everyone lets the bass be the bass. Unless the trombone be the trombone. This is the interrelatedness of jazz, the interrelatedness of jazz and diversity. So long before civil rights, long before Brown versus the Board of Education, long before Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in baseball, or before Truman integrated the armed forces, there was diversity in jazz. Jazz musicians, white jazz musicians who performed in downtown Chicago would leave, go to the south side or the west side, play, jam, play together. You have probably one of the greatest band leaders in Benny Goodman, who always had an African-American musician or several musicians be part of his band. And so for more than 100 years, jazz has led white to black. It's led black to white, west to north, European to American, because it's this fusion. Jazz is this uniquely American music force that has brought everyone together. Very similar to, and it's funny, the question, the 4th of July, very similar to that independence, in which it was all built upon bringing everyone together. I'm moving around, so forgive me a little bit. And so the question is, why seek diversity. You know, the motivation for the jazz musician to seek out diversity is simple, because it makes them better. It enhances their ability to express themselves, differentiate themselves, and find a unique voice. This last point, achieving a recognizable, unique voice, is perhaps the vanguard of the jazz accomplishment, but it's also the fundamental piece of diversity, inclusion, and equity. It's that unique voice that everyone brings to the table. Their unique experience, their unique perception, and their unique of who they are. To understand the need to diversify, the demands on jazz musicians must be understood. Jazz musicians are not expected to try to find their own, they are not only expected to try to find their own unique style, to sound unlike everyone else, they are supposed to continually find new depths, avoid repetition, and frequently reinvent themselves. So as we think back about the founding of the Rotary, it was bringing all of these unique people together to solve common social ills. Because what we find is that when you have a diverse team, when you have diverse organizations, they're able to solve those complex issues that society faces. It's only when we tend to focus on ourselves and people that are similar to us that we end up not being able to really solve issues. You know, so why does this matter now? I'm gonna speak, so the diversity dividend, this is a great study, and I can forward it out by McKinsey. It's important. What's the likelihood that companies, and this is not just companies, they did it on Fortune 500 companies. This works for any organization. What's the likelihood that companies in the top quartile for diversity financially outperform those in the bottom quartile? If you're 15%, if you're gender diverse, you will outperform non-gender diverse companies or organizations by over 15%. That's the bottom line. That's the strategy. That's why gender diversity is important. If you're ethnically diverse, you outperform by 35%. So you think about all of these top performing companies, and I spent a long time of my career in consumer goods, Sara Lee and PepsiCo in particular. And when you look at, and Sara Lee unfortunately doesn't exist the way we know it, as when I was there. We use PepsiCo every year for almost 40 years have returned a dividend. And when you look at PepsiCo's senior leaders, when you look at their organization, it's extremely diverse. It was the first company to have an all African American sales force, 1940. The first to have a woman on the board. The first to have an African American vice president. The first to have a minority franchisee, the Rodriguez family in Laredo, Texas. All of these elements of diversity is what made PepsiCo, and makes other companies, I'm just using them as an example because that's where I was at for a long period of my career. That's what made them exceptional, because they understood the market, they understood who was buying their products, and they understood who influenced their product. So when you look at municipalities, corporations, nonprofits, and foundations are talking about more than ever diversity and inclusion. And a lot of this has come to the forefront because, you know, the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, marriage equality, the achievement gap, the achievement pay gap, which is actually a very interesting conversation when you look at pay gaps, okay? The conversation tends to focus generically on men and women. But if you were to actually dig deeper into that and look at the pay gaps, the difference between white women and women of color is much greater than between white men and white women. And so there's that equity piece as well. So you have the equity in terms of the gender equity, but then you have the racial equity that's built into this gender conversation as well. So just something to think about. So when you think about who here works in a nonprofit, runs a nonprofit, okay, so I want you to think about this. The majority of people that you're serving are who? Probably low income, disadvantaged somehow, however we want to term it. People of color, African American, Latino, probably a good percentage is also girls, women. But then start to think now about who's providing the direct service to the youth or to the people that you're serving. And then take it even that next level, who's in the leadership of those organizations. Okay, so when you look at diversity and inclusion, this is where I think corporations do a great job. And they understand this, and I think this is the lesson that nonprofits can use, is that corporations realize that there's this war on talent. We hear it all the time, but it's specifically important today when you think about millennials, because when my generation and those generations before me, you know, the goal was you get a job, for the most part, you work that job. I never forget when I changed from the Tribune to Sarah Lee's. Only there for 2 years. How are you gonna get a pension? That's what my mom said. You know? And so, because her generation and what they instilled in us was that you get a job, you work that job for 40 years, you leave that job with a pension. Okay? That was the rule. Okay? But now you have this new group that are gonna change jobs 2, 3, 4 times before they're 30, at a minimum, okay? But then when they look at companies, one of the first things they do, and someone who's done HR and diversity for a long time, they actually research, they look at and see who are the leaders. Do I see myself in that organization? Can I grow in that? Are they giving back to the community? And I think that's a piece where nonprofits often miss. When we look at issues facing particularly African American men, boys, Hispanic boys, is that they don't necessarily see someone who looks like them in leadership. And that's important. You can have the direct service, and it's important to have people on the ground working and talking. But the aspiration is for those young boys, those young girls, to be able to sit at the seat in which decisions are made. And if they don't see themselves, they begin to ask themselves, why do I do all of this? Why should I come? Because at the end of the day, this is my lot. And so when you're looking at diversity, it's also looking at how your organization is structured, who's in charge, and who's leading the organization. Now, I'm not saying everyone, because you may serve 90% African American boys, that's supposed to be 90% African American boys. But there needs to be people that looks and represents them. And so that's one of the pieces in terms of for nonprofits. You know, at ECF, and I'm great to have, you know, Jeannie, Michelle, Bill was a former board member who really helped set the stage, looking at equity. And so in Evanston, you know, we're quick, and this is very similar to growing up in Orlando, Iowa. College towns, very similar. We'll say at the drop of the beat that we are diverse, we believe in diversity, we encourage everyone to be themselves, which is good. But then you get the question of equity. And then that's when the conversation shifts. Because with equity, what happens is that people automatically make an assumption that if this school, because it's mostly Latino, English as a second language, if they get this, then all of a sudden my kids are getting something taken away. You know, and the equity piece says that what does this kid, this child, this school needs in order for them to be able to reach their full potential. It asks the same question over here. Now the question over here may be totally different. We send our son, Joy took Mark to high school orientation on Tuesday. You can see who went and who didn't go. I never goes too big. And they're walking around, and he comes back, and I guess I should have known, but I really didn't know him. Comes back with these Chromebooks. I'm like, oh, that's cool. That every kid gets a Chromebook. I mean, you have to pay for it, of course. But if you can't pay for it, I think it's the $79, everyone has to pay part of your fee. If you can't pay for it, there's scholarships. Because what it says is this. This is the equity piece that a small example of equity at ETHS. It says that in 2018, everyone needs to have access to technology. Not everyone can afford technology. So in order to make it accessible for everyone, we're going to offer it, give it to everyone, and then everyone has the same tools. And if you can't afford it, there's a scholarship for you to be able to get it, but you're not denied because you don't have access to it. So your education, I mean, we can talk education forever, I mean, which goes back with regards to equity. But at least it says we're trying to address this piece of equity. You know, there's other things we could talk about, but that's one of the examples. You know, and so at ECF, we're doing this by going into the community to better ECF, Evanston Community Foundation, to understand the needs and diversifying our board, our staff, in order to bring about different perspectives. Because when you think about Evanston, there's a lot of different perspectives. Not a lot of voices are always heard. But our goal is, as a convener, to be able to bring everyone to the table to discuss the issues. Very similar to that of Paul Harris, of bringing everybody to the table to address the needs and the issues that the community is facing. That's what we're doing at ECF. That's what the purpose of diversity, inclusion, and equity is to bring everyone to the table, to have everyone have an opportunity to be heard, to be engaged, to be able to speak their truth. It allows for the trombone to be the trombone, the trumpet to be the trumpet. It allows for the bass to be the bass, and not the bass to pretend that she's the trombonist. But it allows the bass to speak the bass's truth. And that's what we do at ECF. That's what I know you do at the Rotary, from the researchers, knowing Michelle, Ajit, and Mike, and others, Bill. I know that's what you do here. And I ask all the organizations, especially those that serve people of color, to ask yourselves, and people of color and girls, especially, I'm saying young boys of color and girls, because it's a critical time, is that they need to see people who look like them. They also need to see people who have that voice. I think all of us, I'm sure, gets it, but to go back to your organization and to begin to ask that question. And so that's my remarks. I had a lot more to say, but I want to give people time for questions, and I hope you enjoy this. It's been a great thrill. I think I didn't miss any slides, did I? Nope. Are there any questions? Here.
Do you include the formerly incarcerated in your iceberg picture too? Because it's something that I'm a little aware of and paying attention to lately.
Yeah, so great question. So that is a element of diversity. And there's a huge equity question around that as well. Because when you think about incarceration, and when I was in college, after my research fellowship was on single female headed households and the correlation to delinquency. 1988, wow. But and so what you noticed was that, and it was that children of color will get arrested, not just children, adults, arrested for crimes that, particularly white men and more privileged communities, who may get a slap on the wrist, may get a good talking to. And so there's this equity question in there as well. We could look at the opioid conversation now, which impacts mostly rural America, versus when you think about the crack cocaine epidemic of the 80s and 90s, which affected mostly African American, Latino youth in urban America. The interest of how do we solve and not necessarily have this be a imprisoned crime on the opioid, but on the crack cocaine piece to be an actual imprisonment crime, in which both groups are doing the exact same thing, probably for the same reasons, but it's who is being impacted and affected and how it's being portrayed. So it's a great comment, I think, and that's where, not to toot the horn because Joy works there, but that's why organizations such as the Moran Center are so important. Because if it wasn't for organizations like the Moran Center, the Chicago Legal Aid, and other organizations, those youth and their families may end up staying in that cycle and never get a chance to get out.
You ever play jazz at your board meetings?
We never played, no, you know what, and I haven't played the trombone since 1988 when my mom said I couldn't do it anymore. But yeah, we should. Gene.
Yesterday, I asked you if you had read Despite Our Best Intentions. And I failed to pick up on the fact that Mark started in high school.
Yes.
In June, I would like to sit down, four of us, maybe we'll include Mark, and discuss it. Those of you who haven't read Despite Our Best Intentions, it's an excellent research document on the performance gap at Evanston High School and what causes it. And I'm interested to hear how things have changed in the last 7 or 8 years.
When you think of education, by a show of hands, who participated in Head Start? Just me?
Head Start.
Familiar with Head Start? Huh?
Head Start, before your time.
So Head Start.
Too old for Head Start.
Oh, for real? Okay.
We're old,
Yeah.
sorry.
So, but when you think about that, the achievement gap, you also think about equity. And I'll say this, because our kids went to Lincolnwood, and at the time when Fred Hunter was the principal, and it was important because I think about, and I grew up in Auburn, Ohio, probably one of the most diverse, liberal, to the left communities you will ever come across. Okay? I never had an African American principal. I had one African American male teacher in 12 years of school. So think about that. So in my mind, the one thing that I always thought is that I could never be a teacher because I never saw myself teaching. And so when you think about the education gap, there's a lot of things that play into that. And I know at ECF, one of the things that we're looking to address through the Cradles to Career and other programs is that part of the education gap is also getting kids an opportunity to see themselves. And I understand it starts, a lot of times, 0 to 3, there's big issues, but even when they get to kindergarten, when they get to first grade, second grade, they may not see a male of color outside a gym until at middle school. Well, if there's any other questions, thank you very much.
you so much for being with us, Tim. We have, we make a donation to the Evanston Public